My legs were twisted from birth, useless as driftwood. Every step was pain, every crawl a humiliation. Did you know that some say Ivar the Boneless could not even walk, yet he commanded the greatest Viking army ever to strike England? I remember the longhouse thick with smoke, the laughter of my brothers as they wrestled and mocked me. They thought me cursed, a cripple doomed to silence. But when the war horn sounded, it was I they carried into battle, and it was I who gave the commands. This is Viking life, merciless, unflinching, and absolute. Stay with me and witness the truth behind it. I was born of Ragnar and Aslog, and when the midwives unwrapped me, they gasped. My legs bent like storm-broken branches, twisted and useless for walking. In the glow of the hearth fire, their faces paled. They whispered of curses, of shame, of an infant who should not live past his first breath. One of them even dared to murmur that I ought to be left outside in the frost, the way weaklings often were, to return to the earth before they became a burden. But my mother refused despair. Aslog, daughter of the dragon slayer Sigurd and shield maiden Brynhild, looked upon me and saw not a curse, but a sign. Her voice cut sharper than any sword when she silenced the midwives. She cradled me close, and while others flinched, she whispered that the Norns had stolen my bones but laced my soul with iron. She said I had been marked by the gods themselves, a vessel not of weakness but of destiny. My father Ragnar stood nearby, torn between pride and unease. He had fathered strong sons, Ubba, Halfdan, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, sons who ran like wolves through the halls. Yet here was I, crawling even in birth, a boy fated to never stand. I saw the conflict in his eyes, though I was barely able to draw breath. Love bound him to me, but pity gnawed at him, and in our world pity was a wound deeper than steel. Still, I lived. My mother bathed me not only in water, but in prophecy. She told the story of how Sigurd once slew Fafnir, a dragon of greed and fire, though he too bore wounds of fate. She said the Norns weave not to please men, but to balance the threads of the world. My crooked legs were not a mistake. They were the shape of the saga yet to come. And so I grew, not as the others did. While my brothers tested their strength in the yard, swinging axes as tall as they were, I dragged myself across the rushes of the longhouse floor. Every movement tore skin, every breath reminded me of what I lacked, but the shame others hoped to see in me never took root. For each time I faltered, I remembered my mother's voice. The gods have marked you, they have stolen bones, but given you iron. Even the thralls, who gossiped in corners, began to watch me differently. They muttered that children such as I were omens, that kingdoms would fall or rise with the cripple's laughter. I learned early that fear could be as powerful as muscle, and whispers could do the work of spears. I did not yet know the weight of command, nor the bitterness of mockery that my brothers would soon heap upon me. But I knew this. My birth was no accident. It was the first stroke of a saga that would be written not by hands that swung swords, but by a will that refused to break. From that day forward, survival was no gift. It was a challenge hurled by the gods themselves, and I swore I would answer it. The longhouse was always alive with noise. My brothers filled it with shouts and laughter, their bodies crashing together like young bulls. Ubba wrestled with Halfdan until benches splintered, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye laughed so hard the smoke of the fire curled into his throat. I, meanwhile, dragged myself across the rush-strewn floor, my arms straining, my legs trailing like dead branches. Their eyes followed me, and their laughter turned sharp. "Look at him," Halfdan said once, his voice carrying above the din. "Our brother is more worm than wolf." The others roared, and though the words stung, I forced my face into stone. Better to bleed inside than give them the pleasure of seeing it on my skin. In our world, weakness was death. A boy who could not run, who could not stand in the shield wall, was less than nothing. They reminded me of this at every turn. When they returned from the practice yard with sweat steaming from their bodies, they made sure I heard their boasts. When they lifted swords too heavy for my arms, they placed them before me as if daring me to try, knowing I could not. Their taunts were a chorus, sharp as spearheads. But every insult was not wasted on me. I gathered them like kindling. Each word burned hotter inside me, feeding a fire my brothers could not see. They thought me frail, but I learned the strength of silence. I watched their contests, memorizing the way Halfdan overreached, how Ubba's temper betrayed him, how Sigurd's laughter blinded him to danger. I could not match them in strength, but I could read them, and reading a man is more deadly than striking him. Sometimes I dreamed of leaping to my feet, of hurling myself upon them with sudden strength, of seeing their mocking eyes turn to terror. Yet when I woke, my legs lay twisted as ever, and rage was my only weapon. Still, I sharpened it, day by day, like a whetstone on steel. My father Ragnar watched in silence. Perhaps he pitied me, perhaps he feared what I was becoming. But my mother Aslaug saw more. She placed a hand on my head one evening as the others jeered, and she whispered, "Do not strike them with fists, Ivar. Strike them with fear. Fear will make even your strongest brother kneel." And so I began to speak. At first it was only small barbs, a word to sting harder than a slap, a reminder of their failures dressed as jest. Soon the others grew wary, for I knew where to press. My tongue became my sword, my silence my shield. They could break my body, but they could not break my will. Thus, in the firelit hall of my father, mocked and belittled, I learned my first lesson in power. Strength lies not only in the arm, but in the mind that guides it. And though I crawled, I knew one day they would follow me. Winter pressed hard that year, the kind of cold that bit through wool and numbed even the marrow of bones. Snow piled high against the walls of our hall, and the fjord lay frozen like a mirror of iron. It was then the seer came, cloaked in furs stiff with frost, his staff carved with runes older than memory. The people made way for him, for no man dared stand between a seer and the hearth. I remember the firelight casting his face in strange shapes as he sat by the flames. His eyes were white, clouded like milk, but when they turned toward me, I felt their weight. The hall grew quiet. Even my brothers fell silent, their laughter stilled as though the gods themselves had stepped into the smoke. He gazed into the fire for a long time, muttering words none could understand. Then, suddenly, his voice broke into clarity. "This one," he said, pointing with a crooked finger at me, crawling among the rushes. "This one, who cannot walk, will break kingdoms. The cripple shall become terror, and his name shall outlive stone." The words struck like a hammer. My brothers smirked, unable to believe such prophecy could belong to me. Ubba laughed openly, pounding his fist on the table. "The gods mock us. A cripple, breaker of kingdoms?" Even my father Ragnar gave a half smile, as though the seer's words were no more than fire dreams. But my mother Aslaug's eyes burned like coals. She believed, she had always believed, even when others despaired at my twisted legs. She leaned closer to the seer, asking, "By what fate? By what hand?" He only shook his head. "The Norns weave in silence. He will carry no blade, yet blades will move at his word. His enemies will fear him more than thunder, more than storm." The hall erupted in murmurs. Some muttered that I was cursed, a trick of Loki placed in Ragnar's bloodline. Others whispered that Odin himself had marked me, stripping flesh of strength but gifting spirit with fire. I said nothing. I only watched the flames dance and thought how fitting it was that they bent and broke yet never ceased burning. That night I lay awake long after the hall grew still. I turned the seer's words over and over in my mind. Breaker of kingdoms, a cripple who would outlast stone. The laughter of my brothers still rang in my ears, but beneath it, deeper and stronger, echoed the prophecy. I clung to it, like a drowning man clings to driftwood. From then on, I saw myself differently. Each insult became proof of the seer's vision, each moment of struggle a test of the god's favour. I began to believe that my body was no mistake, but a forge. The pain, the crawling, the humiliation, it was fire-tempering iron. And so, while others laughed, I listened to the silence between words. I studied men as the seer had studied flame. I knew my fate would not be written by legs that failed me, but by a mind sharpened in shadow. The prophecy had been spoken. My saga had begun. From the day the seer spoke, I no longer measured myself by the strength of limbs. My brothers boasted of their arms, of the weight of their axes, of how many paces they could run before tiring. I watched them, yes, but I watched more closely than they realized. Every strike, every stumble, every flaw these I stored in silence. If I could not fight beside them, I would learn how to command above them. The Longhouse was my first battlefield. I listened to the skalds who came to sing of heroes, their voices carrying the wisdom of ages. I caught every verse, every hidden lesson in their songs. While my brothers clapped to the rhythm and drank deep from horns of mead, I memorized tactics buried in rhyme, how one warrior deceived another, how battles were won not by strength alone, but by cunning. When raiders returned from the sea, their shields splintered, their faces marked with cuts, I questioned them. How did the enemy form their shield wall? What weakness had broken their line? They thought me curious, a crippled boy with no place on the battlefield, but I gathered their stories like treasure. Soon I could map the rhythm of combat in my head, as if I had stood among them. Even the thralls became my teachers. They whispered in corners, unseen by warriors, but I heard them. They knew how fear moved through a village, how gossip spread like fire through dry reeds. They taught me the power of words, the sway of rumour. A sword can cut flesh, but a whisper can bring down a hall before a blade is ever drawn. At night I studied the world beyond the firelight. I learned how frost hardened the ground and slowed the march of men, how tides obeyed the pull of the moon and could trap ships upon the shore. I watched ravens, how they circled carrion, always waiting, never rushing, letting hunger guide their patience. I told myself I must be as they were sharp-eyed, relentless, unhurried. My brothers still mocked me, but their jeers grew quieter. They did not yet fear me, but they began to sense that I was different. They noticed that when arguments rose among them, my words cut deeper than their fists. A glance, a phrase, a reminder of some past failure, and suddenly their boasting faltered. It was then I realized that my tongue had become sharper than steel. Once, when Uber quarrelled with Halfdan over a stolen horse, I spoke softly, only a few words, but enough to set them snarling at each other until Ragnar himself had to intervene. I sat silent, but inside I felt the rush of triumph. I had turned brother against brother with nothing but thought and word. I could not walk. I could not swing a sword as they did, but I could shape the field upon which they fought. I could bend their wills as easily as a smith bends iron in flame. And so I forged my first true weapon, my mind. My father Ragnar stood taller than most men, his hair streaked with silver, but his back still straight as a spear. To the world he was a sea king, a terror to Saxon shores, a name carried on the wind like a storm warning. To me he was both father and judge, a shadow so vast that even firelight seemed dim beside him. I longed for his approval, yet dreaded the pity that always flickered in his eyes when he looked upon my legs. He loved me, I know this, but love alone could not smother the doubts that lived in his heart. In our world, a son was measured by his place in the shield wall, by the strength of his arm, by the victories he carved with steel. He looked upon Ubba, broad as an ox, and smiled. He looked upon Halfdan, fierce as a wolf, and nodded with pride. He looked upon Sigurd Snake in the eye, cunning and bold, and gave him counsel as an equal. Then his gaze fell upon me, crawling, twisted, burning with a fire no one else could see, and his eyes softened with sorrow. That softness cut deeper than a sword. I remember once, when the men of the village gathered to train, I dragged myself to the yard to watch. The clatter of shields and clash of axes rang sharp in the air. Ragnar stood at the centre, guiding them with a warrior's voice. I shouted advice from where I sat in the dirt, how they should tighten their shield wall, how they should feign retreat and strike again. Some laughed at me, some ignored me, but Ragnar turned, his face unreadable. For a heartbeat, I thought he would praise me, that he had finally seen my worth. Instead, he shook his head and said, "Save your breath, Ivar. Leave such matters to those who can stand." The words struck like a blow. My brothers smirked, and I clenched my fists until nails cut my palms. I swallowed my rage, but that night, alone by the hearth, I whispered an oath to the gods. I swore that one day Ragnar would be remembered not for the sons who stood tall, but for the crippled son who bent kingdoms. Yet, I also saw the burden he carried. Ragnar was not blind to my spirit. He knew that to expose me was to invite the scorn of others, and scorn weakens a family's line. So he shielded me in silence, neither praising me openly nor condemning me outright. I lived in the half-light of his recognition, never rejected, never fully embraced. But shadows are where fire glows brightest. In Ragnar's shadow, I grew sharper, hungrier. His doubt became my whetstone. Each time he overlooked me, I hardened my resolve. Each glance of pity became fuel for vengeance against every man who dared to measure me by legs instead of will. I was Ragnar's son, but I swore to be more. One day the sagas would tell of Ragnar Lodbrok, great sea king, and they would add, in the same breath, that he was the father of Ivar the Boneless, who broke the world though he could not stand. It began with a whisper, a word spoken by a thrall who should have known silence. He was a broad man, scarred from labour, one of those who carried buckets of water and chopped wood for the hearth. He looked at me, crawling across the floor, my arms pulling my useless legs behind me, and he spat into the rushes. "Half a man," he muttered, but loud enough that others heard. Laughter rippled through the hall, small at first, then swelling like a tide. Rage filled me, hotter than the fire itself. My brothers had mocked me, yes, but they were bound by blood. This man was no kin, no equal. He was property, lower even than the ground I dragged myself upon. For him to speak so boldly, to strike me with words before the eyes of warriors, was more than insult. It was a wound to my honour, and wounds must be answered. I could not strike him with my hand. My twisted body would never rise to meet his strength. But my tongue had become sharper than iron, and my will was stronger than any man's arm. I turned to the warriors nearest, those who carried Ragnar's name upon their lips, and I spoke. My words were not shouted, but cold, precise. "He has spat upon me," I said. "He has spat upon Ragnar's blood. Will you let this stand?" Silence fell. The laughter faded. The thrall's face drained of colour as all eyes turned toward him. He stammered, tried to kneel, tried to beg, but I gave no quarter. "Take him outside," I commanded, "and let the ravens taste his tongue." At first no one moved. I was still the cripple in their eyes, still a boy with legs like driftwood. But then Ubba, broad-shouldered and grinning, rose to his feet. "Let it be done," he said. "Our brother commands." And with that, the hall stirred. Warriors seized the thrall, dragging him by his arms, his heels scraping against the floor. His pleas filled the smoke, high and broken, but no one listened. They hauled him into the snow. I followed, crawling to the doorway, my hands freezing against the ice. The sky was black, the moon veiled. They threw him down, and in the white silence I gave the order, "Kill him." The blow was swift, an axe cleaving through bone, a scream that ended in nothing. Blood steamed on the snow, spreading like ink upon parchment. Ravens stirred from the trees, their wings beating against the night. I felt no pity. Instead, I felt power rush through me, raw and intoxicating. Not because I had struck the blow, but because the blow had fallen at my word. For the first time, I had commanded death, and death had obeyed. When they carried his body away, the warriors looked at me differently, some with fear, some with respect, none with laughter. That night, I slept deeper than ever before. I had tasted power, and it burned hotter than any fire. From then on, I knew this truth. My body was weak, but my will was absolute, and with my will I could make men die. The hall no longer laughed as freely when I dragged myself across the floor. They remembered the thrall whose blood had steamed in the snow at my command. They remembered that I, the cripple, had given the order, and that warriors stronger than mountains had obeyed. Fear had slipped into their voices, subtle at first, but enough that I could taste it. Among my brothers, the mockery softened, though it never vanished. Ubba still boasted, Halfdan still jeered, and Sigurd still smirked with his serpent's eye gleaming. Yet when I spoke, they listened more closely than before. They did not admit it, but they knew that I had found a weapon greater than muscle. I had learned how to bend men without touching them, how to twist silence into obedience. I had become a wolf among wolves, small in body, but sharp of tooth. I began to test this power in small ways. When arguments flared among the men, I whispered a word, and suddenly the quarrel would blaze hotter. A careless insult here, a reminder of a past slight, there soon fists flew, and the hall filled with roars. I sat silent, watching, learning how easily men could be guided, as if their pride were reins in my hands. My mother saw this and nodded with grim satisfaction. "You cannot strike as they do," she told me once, her hand resting on my shoulder. "So you must learn to strike deeper. Wolves do not always kill with their fangs, they kill with the pack." Her words were a lesson, and I carved them into memory. I also began to weave myself into my brother's plans. Ubba sought glory in battle, Halfdan in raids, Sigurd in cunning alliances. I learned to place myself at the edge of their desires, offering counsel that seemed to serve them while binding them closer to me. "Strike here, not there," I would say. "Wait for the tide to turn, then attack." And when their ventures succeeded, they boasted of their strength, never realizing that it had been my voice guiding their hands. At night, when the hall grew quiet and only the embers glowed, I thought of wolves circling prey. They were beasts of cunning, not wasteful in their hunger. They tested, they waited, they chose the weakest moment to strike. I told myself I must be as they were, for I was among wolves every day, and only cunning would keep me from being devoured. Once, Halfdan challenged me openly, asking what use I could possibly be when I could not lift a sword. I answered with silence, letting him sweat in the pause. Then I told him where the enemy's scouts would be found on his next raid, how they could be ambushed and slain. He scoffed, but when the raid returned successful, the men whispered of my foresight. Halfdan glared at me, but he said nothing more. Thus I grew, not as warrior of the arm, but as warrior of the mind. I had found my place. Among wolves, I too had become a wolf. Blood binds stronger than rope, stronger than iron. My brothers mocked me, yes, but when battle called, they did not leave me behind. They carried me on shields, on carts, on their very shoulders into the storm of war. For all our quarrels, for all the words that cut like blades, we were sons of Ragnar, and that name was a bond no jeer could sever. I remember one raid along the coast of Svealand. The longships carved their way through grey water, the prows crowned with snarling dragons. My brothers stood at the rails, salt spray on their faces, axes in hand. I sat lashed to the mast, the sea bucking beneath me, my legs dead weight, my arms clutching rope until my hands bled. Some thought me a burden, a cripple who should have been left in the hall. But when the horns blew and the shore loomed near, it was I who spoke the words of order. Strike where they are weakest, burn their boats before their houses. My brothers listened, even as they laughed, for they had learned my counsel bore fruit. And when they returned with spoils heavy on their shoulders, their laughter softened, turned grudgingly into respect. Still, we fought among ourselves. Uber's rage was quick, Halfdan's pride sharper than steel, and Sigurd's wit always seeking advantage. Often they clashed, fists and tempers boiling over like mead in a cauldron. Yet when one of us bled, the others bled too. We might wound each other with words, but no outsider could strike us without feeling the fury of all. It was during one such quarrel that I learned the depth of our bond. A chieftain from another clan mocked me openly, calling me a curse upon Ragnar's line. I bit down my fury, but before I could answer, Ubba rose with murder in his eyes. "Mock him," he growled, "and you mock us all." The hall erupted in violence, and when it ended, the chieftain's nose lay broken, his pride shattered. My brothers had defended me, not with pity, but with blood. From then on, I understood, though they jeered, though they doubted, my brothers carried my weight not only on their shoulders, but in their hearts. They would not abandon me, and I, in turn, would not let them lead blindly. I bound myself into their ambitions, sharpening their fury with my cunning. Ubba's strength, Halfdan's daring, Sigurd's craft. They became extensions of my will, even when they did not see it. Blood is a chain, unbreakable even in fire. We were wolves, snapping at each other, yet always turning together when the scent of prey filled the wind. They were my tormentors and my protectors, my rivals and my allies. And I knew this truth. With my brothers as arms and legs, and my mind as their helm, we could carve kingdoms from stone. Together, bound by blood, we would shake the world. The first time they carried me aboard a dragon ship, the world shifted beneath me. The planks groaned, the sea heaved, and the cold salt spray struck my face like a slap. My legs, useless as driftwood, slid awkwardly as they lowered me onto the deck. Warriors glanced sideways, some smirking, others shaking their heads, as though the cripple had no place among them. But I clutched the carved prow with both hands and swore an oath before the ravens that wheeled above. If the sea mocked me, I would make kingdoms kneel. The ship itself was alive. Its dragon's head snarled into the wind, painted red to frighten spirits and men alike. Shields lined its flanks, bright as scales, while oars dipped and rose in rhythm, like the beating of a giant's heart. The smell of tar, salt, and sweat mingled in the air. To many, it was simply a vessel. To me, it was a throne my chariot across the waters, a seat from which I could command the fates of nations. As the men rowed, I studied them. Strong arms bent with the pull of the sea, veins standing out like ropes beneath their skin. Each stroke was power, but without guidance, power is wasted. I saw in their rhythm the shape of battle men moving as one body, stronger together than apart. I vowed that one day I would bend not only their oars, but their wills, until they pulled at my command across both sea and land. We sailed to raid a Saxon village, the coast shrouded in mist. Warriors leapt into the shallows, shields raised, axes gleaming. I remained on the ship, my body bound to a beam, but my voice carried across the tide. "Strike the boats first," I called. "Burn them where they lie." They hesitated, glancing at each other, but my brothers relayed my words. Fire soon roared along the shoreline, and before the Saxons could flee, their escape was ash and smoke. The raid was swift, merciless, complete. When they returned laden with spoils, the men laughed and boasted, but their eyes turned toward me differently. No longer only the cripple to be carried, I had been the one whose counsel sharpened their victory. I tasted the salt of the sea on my lips and felt it mix with the iron of triumph. That night, as the ship rocked gently at anchor, I lay against the mast and whispered my oath again. I swore to the gods that though I could not walk a single step across the deck, I would stride across nations. The ship would be my legs, the men my strength, the banner my voice, and where the dragon prows sailed, there too would sail my will. From that night onward, the dragon ship was no longer a vessel. It was my chariot of war, and I was no longer bound to crawling earth. I was bound to conquest. The fire in the hearth burned low that night, its smoke curling like a serpent through the rafters. My father Ragnar sat upon the high seat, his face shadowed by flame. He spoke of glory, of raiding lands richer than ours, of proving once more that his name struck fear across the sea. His voice filled the hall like thunder, and the men roared their approval. Yet beneath his words, I heard the hunger of a man who longed for one last great deed. Ragnar asked us, his sons, a question that would haunt me all my days. "If I fall," he said, his eyes glinting in the half-light, "who among you will avenge me?" Ubba pounded his chest, boasting that he would carry fire across kingdoms. Halfdan swore by Odin that rivers would run red with Saxon blood. Sigurd Snake in the Eye lifted his head with quiet confidence, declaring that his cunning alone would break any king who dared stand against him. I said nothing. My brothers laughed, taking my silence for weakness, another mark of the cripple's shame. But my silence was not emptiness, it was iron. Inwardly, I carved an oath deeper than theirs. If Ragnar fell, I would not merely avenge him with raids and plunder. I would drown kingdoms in war, topple thrones, and carve my father's name into the very bones of England. Not long after, word came that Ragnar had set sail again, this time with only a small band, too few for a man of his renown. He claimed it was bravery, a test of fate, but I saw the truth. He wished for death or victory, nothing less. My mother Aslaug wept, but he comforted her with half smiles and promises of glory. My brothers sharpened their axes, ready to follow, yet Ragnar forbade it. He would go alone, he said, to prove himself once more to gods and men. When tidings reached us that he had been captured by King Aella of Northumbria, the hall fell into silence. Then came the tale of his doom, how Ragnar was thrown into a pit of serpents, their coils wrapping around his limbs, their fangs sinking into his flesh. The Saxons watched as the great Sea King, scourge of Europe, met his end not on the battlefield, but in a pit of writhing death. Yet even in dying, Ragnar mocked his enemies. They said his voice rose above the hiss of snakes as he laughed and sang of his sons, boasting that they would avenge him. His last breath was not of fear, but of prophecy. When I heard the tale, my heart turned to stone. My brothers wept openly, their grief pouring like mead. I clenched my jaw until blood filled my mouth. The world thought Ragnar's line would fade with his death. But I swore that his doom would not be the end, it would be the beginning. That night I dreamed of fire spreading across England, of banners black as ravens blotting out the Sunday Ragnar had fallen, but through me his vengeance would rise like a storm no king could withstand. The tidings came as winter's breath lingered on the land. Messengers arrived, their faces pale, their voices quivering as they told us what we already dreaded. Ragnar was dead. Not by storm or by steel, not by the clash of shield walls, but in a pit of serpents dug by Saxon hands. I listened in silence as they spoke of how the snakes writhed around him, how their fangs pierced his flesh again and again, how King Aella of Northumbria looked down upon him with cruel triumph. My brothers reacted as wolves whose den has been burned. Ubba struck the table with such force that the wood split beneath his fist. Halfdan roared, his voice shaking the rafters, while Sigurd Snake in the Eye wept openly, his tears streaking through the paint upon his face. Each man cried for vengeance, each swore an oath of blood. Their grief was loud, wild, and untempered. I, too, burned inside, but no tears left my eyes. I clenched my jaw until it ached, tasting the copper tang of blood where my teeth bit through my own lip. My heart hammered, yet my voice was steady when I finally spoke. Do you not hear his laughter? Even as the serpents bit, Ragnar sang of us. He told them we would come. He mocked his killers with prophecy. Shall we prove him liar? The hall grew quiet. My brothers turned toward me, their grief momentarily stilled by my words. I felt the weight of their gazes, the fire of their fury seeking a channel. "No," I continued, "we will not strike blindly. Aella believes he has broken us. He believes Ragnar's line is ended with his body in that pit. We will show him the truth. We will not avenge Ragnar with one raid, nor with one battle. We will bring an army so vast that the Saxons will choke on our vengeance. England itself will drown." Even as I spoke, I could see the shift in them. Ubba's rage found focus. Halfdan's pride found purpose. Sigurd's sorrow found steel. The thralls in the hall crossed themselves and muttered of demons, but the warriors raised their horns and shouted until the timbers shook. It was not grief alone that filled the air now, but destiny. That night, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames as they twisted and broke, only to rise again. I thought of my father in the pit, serpents coiling around him, his voice defiant to the end. His death was not defeat, it was a summons. The Saxons had kindled a fire that would consume their world. I felt no pity for them. They had chosen their fate when they cast Ragnar into that pit. The seer's prophecy returned to me. The cripple would break kingdoms. Now I knew how. My legs would never carry me to battle, but my will would carry legions. From that night onward, my father's death was no wound. It was the forge that shaped me. Ragnar's doom was my birthright, and England would pay the price in blood. We gathered before Ragnar's pyre as the last embers glowed, and the night pulled a cold cloak over the longhouse. Men came from near and far, blooded warriors, oath-bound thanes, even traders who had once crossed my father's path. The air smelled of smoke and wet wool, and the sky held the pale watch of the moon. There was no cheering, only the low hum of men's voices, and beneath them all the hard drum of grief. My brothers stood at my shoulder, each a different kind of storm. Ubba's face was a slab of granite, anger carved into every line. Halfdan's eyes burned like coals. He could not sit still, like a hound who wanted to hunt. Sigurd's snake in the eye folded his hands and watched the flames as if reading the future in their tongues. They looked to me as if expecting something, some small thing from the crippled son that could turn their grief into action. Ragnar's body lay wrapped in linen, his beard smoked by the pyre, and for a moment I saw him as he had been, tall, laughing, a god of sea and salt. I felt the weight of all that name meant press against my ribs. Then, as the embers brightened and the men leaned closer, I rose with the slow certainty of a tide. "By Odin," I said, the name not taken lightly but felt in the marrow. "By the blood that runs in these halls, we swear." My voice did not falter. It carried across the crowd, down to the thralls, up to the eaves. The silence broke like thin ice. One by one we swore. Ubba spat into his fist and vowed to strike down the houses that sheltered Aella's men. Halfdan, teeth bared, swore he would break their shields and drive them from every ford. Sigurd swore in quieter words, promising cunning, to unmake their alliances, to slit the throats of their plans before any blade was drawn. When it came to me, eyes turned, and the murmur rose, curiosity edged with the old mockery. I spoke only what I had long held like a blade in my throat. We will not be simple raiders in this. We will not shame ourselves with petty vengeance. My brother's jaws tightened. Ragnar's death is not to be avenged by one feast or one burned hall. We will summon men from every harbour, from Dublin to the Northern Isles, from Danish fjord to Frisian marsh. We will make an army that does not come for spoil but to remain. We will settle where we choose and set our laws upon their soil. When Aella wakes, the land will already be carved. Murmurs turned into roars. Men banged shields, slapped the hafts of their axes. The thralls crossed themselves or spat. The oath was no mere promise of blood, it was a plan wrapped in fury. It marked a change from raid to conquest, from rage to design. Aslog stepped forward then, cloak dark against the firelight, and laid a hand upon my shoulder. Her voice was steady. "The Norns weave," she said. and we must thread with them. This oath is not only blood, it is destiny." The men bowed their heads as if to some ancient law. We sealed the vow with wine and broken bread, with the lash of shield against shield. Names were called, houses pledged, oaths taken in the name of gods and kin. Each vow made the web tighter, drew in men who had only yesterday been strangers. When the pyre burned low and the crowd thinned into the cold, I sat by the dying embers and felt the oath settle in my bones like frost. Not blood alone would make this right, but the slow, relentless work of a people taking root. Ragnar had died in a pit of serpents. Aella had thought he ended a line. Instead, by oath around a smoky pyre, we began to stitch a new order across the sea, and the world would remember. After Ragnar's pyre had cooled to ash, and the vows still burned upon our tongues, the work began. Vengeance is not carried on a single ship or a handful of blades. It must be forged, piece by piece, as a smith forges iron into a weapon. We sons of Ragnar swore not to raid but to conquer, and for that we would need an army unlike any seen before. Messengers rode out from our halls, their cloaks snapping in the wind, carrying words of fire to every chieftain who owed us loyalty or feared to deny us. They travelled to the fjords of Norway, where men hardened by ice and hunger leapt at the chance for plunder. They crossed to Denmark, where Jarls eager for glory pledged ships and men. Even the sea kings of Dublin answered, sending warriors who had carved their names in Irish blood. From every corner of the Norse world they came, drawn by oaths, greed, and the promise of Ragnar's vengeance. The harbours filled with ships, dragon-prowed and tar-scented, their shields hanging like scales along the sides. Each day new warriors arrived, their armour battered, their axes nicked with old kills. They brought their banners, their wives, even their children, proof that they did not come for a season but for settlement. The sound of hammers echoed as smiths worked day and night, forging spearheads, mending shields, riveting mail. The smell of smoke and iron clung to the air, thick as prophecy. I watched it all from my chariot, carried to the shipyards on the backs of men. Some still stared at me with pity, others with doubt, but all had heard the stories of the cripple who ordered death, of the son of Ragnar who burned with more fire than any man could carry. I spoke little, but when I did, my words bound them tighter than gold. "This is not a raid," I told them. "This is not to fill your purse for a winter's feast. This is to carve kingdoms. Those who follow me will eat from Saxon fields, sleep in Saxon halls, and rule where Saxons now kneel." My brothers, too, played their part. Ubba roared through the camps, rallying men with his brute strength. Halfdan strutted like a hawk, his eyes sharp for those who faltered, cutting down cowardice before it could grow. Sigurd spoke softly, weaving alliances, ensuring rival chieftains bent their knees rather than their swords. Each brother was a pillar, and I, though boneless, was the hand that bound them. By the turning of the seasons, the gathering was complete. Men whispered of the scale of it, hundreds of ships, thousands of warriors. Never had England faced such a storm. Saxon monks, hearing the rumours, wrote of dragons on the sea, of a heathen tide, ready to drown Christ's green land. I felt it then, the prophecy unfolding. The cripple, the one meant to die at birth, had summoned an army greater than kings. I could not walk, yet I would march at the head of a host so vast it would shake the world. The great army was forged, and soon England would feel its weight. Word of our gathering spread across the sea faster than any sail could carry. Saxon monks, cloistered in their stone halls, dipped quills in ink and wrote of omens. They said dragons had been sighted on the horizon, their prows painted with fire and teeth. They whispered of a heathen storm, a tide of iron and fury sweeping from the north. The bells of their churches rang not with joy but with dread. I remember the first time our fleet came into sight of the English coast. Row upon row of dragon ships, their shields gleaming, their oars biting the sea in perfect rhythm. The horizon itself seemed to burn with sails. The air smelled of salt and pitch, the creak of timbers blending with the chant of warriors hungry for land. Never before had the Saxons seen such a sight. They had fought raiders, yes, small bands come to steal and burn before fleeing, but this was no raid, this was war. On the shore, peasants fled from their fields, abandoning ploughs to rust and cattle to wander. Smoke rose from villages before we even landed, for terror moved faster than fire. Those who stayed behind clutched their crosses and prayed to a god I did not know, their voices thin against the roar of waves and war horns. We landed first in East Anglia. Its King Edmund caught unprepared. He offered us horses and food, desperate to appease the storm that had fallen upon his land. We accepted with laughter, not out of mercy, but because every gift was proof of their fear. To us, his tribute was no bargain, it was a confession of weakness. As our army spread inland, stories multiplied. Monks wrote of churches desecrated, of relics stolen, of holy places turned to ash. They called us demons, spawn of Loki, scourges of Christendom. They could not comprehend that we were men, driven by blood, oaths, and hunger. Fear painted us larger than life, gave us wings of shadow and eyes of flame, and so fear itself became a weapon sharper than steel. I took pleasure in that fear. Though my legs could not carry me to the front lines, my name reached the Saxons before my warriors did. Mothers hushed their children with tales of the crippled son of Ragnar, who crawled like a serpent, yet commanded like a king. They said my voice alone could summon death, that to defy me was to court the wrath of gods older than their Christ. The land quaked beneath our passage. Churches locked their doors, kings muttered in council, and peasants abandoned their villages to the wolves. We had not yet spilled much blood, yet already England trembled. This was how kingdoms break, not with the first strike, but with the dread of what is to come. As I watched the Saxons scatter before us, I understood the truth. Ragnar had fallen, but his shadow still darkened their world. Through us, through me, his vengeance had already begun. Fear was the first conquest. Soon, blood would follow. York lay before us like a jewel half buried in mud, its stone walls rising above the ooze, its towers proud yet weary. To the Saxons it was a city of kings, the seat of their power in Northumbria. To me, it was a door, and once it opened, the whole of England would lie waiting. We moved with the swiftness of wolves in winter. Our fleet had carried us up the coast. Our horses, taken from trembling East Anglians, thundered across the frozen ground. The city was divided within itself, two Saxon kings, Osbert and Ella, clawing at each other like dogs over a bone. Their quarrel weakened them, and we came as fire to dry tinder. The first clash was brutal. Our shield wall pressed against theirs outside the gates, the air thick with the clash of iron and the stench of sweat. I was carried forward in my chariot, the wheels grinding over frost, my voice rising above the din. "Push them to the gates! Break their line!" My warriors surged as one body, axes biting, spears thrusting. I could not strike, but my command struck truer than any blade. At last their shield wall buckled, their men staggering back into the city. York's gates closed with a groan, shutting them in like cattle awaiting slaughter. Some of my men urged a retreat, fearing the high walls, but I only laughed. A city divided cannot stand. Let them gnaw at each other inside their own cage. Hunger will weaken them more than swords. So we waited. Smoke rose above the walls as fire and quarrel consumed the city from within. Days turned into weeks. Our scouts reported fighting in the streets, Saxon against Saxon. When at last the gates opened, it was not for battle but for desperation. We surged in, pouring through like a flood, axes flashing, shields splintering. Inside York, chaos reigned. The Saxon kings, desperate to reclaim order, had joined forces too late. Their men fought with the desperation of those who know death is certain. I watched from my chariot as my brothers led the slaughter. Uber's axe carving a path, Halfdan roaring like a bear, Sigurd's eye cold as steel. I directed them where the fighting was fiercest, where the enemy threatened to hold. Step by step, street by street, York fell. When the battle was done, the city lay in ruin. Bodies littered the streets, blood pooled between stones, the cries of the wounded echoing like the wails of the damned. Yet amid the ruin, a throne stood empty. York was ours. I ordered Ragnar's banner raised above the city, its raven wings spread wide. The sight silenced even the survivors. This, I declared, is not mere vengeance. This is conquest. My words echoed against the stone, and my warriors roared in triumph. York had been the heart of Northumbria. Now it was the heart of our dominion. From that moment forward, the Saxons knew that we had not come only to raid and vanish, we had come to rule. And with York in our grasp, England's doom had truly begun. The smoke of York still clung to the air when our scouts brought word. King Ella had been captured. The same Ella who had thrown my father into the pit of serpents, who had watched with cruel eyes as Ragnar met his doom. Now he stood in chains, his crown gone, his pride stripped away. The gods had delivered him into my hands, and I would not waste the gift. They dragged him before me, his face pale, his body trembling beneath the weight of his fate. He tried to hold himself like a king, chin high, eyes steady, but I saw the fear in the way his breath came short and sharp. My brothers ringed him, their weapons resting easy at their sides, but their eyes burned with hunger for vengeance. I spoke not with rage, but with cold certainty. You cast Ragnar into the serpent pit. You thought his line would end there. Now his sons stand before you, and your breath is the last you will take as king. Ella's lips moved as if to pray, but no god of his would save him. I ordered the blood eagle. Some call it cruelty. I call it justice. He was laid upon his face, his arms pinned, his back bared to the sky. The warriors stepped forward, blades in hand, and silence fell heavy upon the field. I did not look away as the steel bit flesh, as ribs cracked open like the hull of a ship against rocks. His lungs were pulled wide, spread like wings glistening with blood. The sight was terrible, yet it was also truth. A life for a life, a king for a king. The warriors roared Ragnar's name as Ella gasped, his voice breaking into cries that carried no further than the crows circling above. When his life fled, the ravens descended, black wings beating against the red earth. I felt the weight of vengeance lift, not fully, but enough that my chest eased with each breath. Ragnar had been avenged, not in silence, but in spectacle, carved into the memory of all who saw. News of Ella's death spread like wildfire across the land. Saxons shuddered at the telling, some denying that such a thing could be done, others swearing they had seen it with their own eyes. Priests called us monsters, demons clad in flesh. Warriors whispered in awe, their voices hushed, as if speaking too loudly would draw the same fate upon them. For me, it was not merely revenge, it was a lesson to all kings. Let them see what becomes of those who defy Ragnar's sons, of those who laugh at a crippled child. Let them know that I, who could not walk, had broken their proudest ruler and offered his lungs to Odin. When the deed was done, I turned to my brothers. This is only the beginning, I told them. We have avenged Ragnar, now we take what is his by right, the whole of England. And they shouted with me, their voices carrying into the smoke-filled sky, sealing our vow in blood. After Ella's blood fed the earth, England did not need to be told what had happened. The story carried itself faster than hoof or sail, whispered from village to village, scrawled in trembling ink by monks who could not bring themselves to write my name without adding demon or beast. To the Saxons, I became a figure larger than life, a cripple who crawled like a serpent, yet commanded like a god. They did not speak of armies first. They spoke of me, the boneless one, whose words split kingdoms and whose wrath tore kings apart. It was then I learned that fear was a sharper weapon than any blade. A sword can cut one man, an axe can cleave another, but fear strikes all at once. Fear rots courage before a battle is ever fought. It makes walls crumble, allies falter, and kings pay tribute rather than risk their thrones. When we marched, the people fled before us. Villages were abandoned, their fires still burning, food left upon tables as if the inhabitants had vanished into smoke. In towns where men had once stood ready with spears, gates now opened at the sight of our banners, their elders kneeling before we loosed a single arrow. Some brought gold, others livestock, and some even offered their sons to serve in our host, better to serve the boneless king than to resist him. My brothers laughed, eager for blood, but I saw greater power in patience. Let them fear, I told them. Do not strike when terror serves us better. A man who has lost courage is already conquered. Ubba grumbled, his axe hungry for red work, but he obeyed. Sigurd understood at once, nodding with that quiet serpent's smile. Halfdan followed, though reluctantly, for he loved the clash of steel more than the silence of victory. Even our enemies began to use my name as a curse. Saxon mothers whispered to their children, "Sleep, or Ivar will come." Priests thundered from their pulpits that I was Loki's spawn, crawling upon the earth to test the faithful. Kings, in their halls, looked to their advisers with pale faces and asked how to stand against a foe who could not even stand himself. They could not see that their fear was my strength, that each whispered tale made my army larger in their minds than it truly was. One night, as our campfires lit the dark, a captured Saxon lord was brought before me. He trembled as he was cast at my feet, eyes wide, lips quivering. "I beg you," he said, "show mercy." I had not spoken a word to him, yet already he was broken. I realized then that this was my gift. Where my legs had failed, fear carried me farther than any stride. From that moment, I wielded terror as I would a spear. I nurtured it, spread it, sharpened it, for I knew the truth. Kingdoms fall not when their kings are slain, but when their people believe defeat has already come. And in England, long before our axes struck, that belief was already spreading like fire in dry grass. After York and the Blood Eagle, our gaze turned south. East Anglia lay before us, a kingdom rich with grain and horses, but weak in heart. Its king, Edmund, was a pious man, more priest than ruler, who thought prayers and relics could stand where shields should. He heard of our coming, of Ragnar avenged and Ella carved open, and he trembled. He sent messengers bearing gifts, horses sleek and strong, gold hammered into crosses, words soft as butter. But I had no hunger for his tribute. Fear is useful, yes, but there comes a time when fear must be sealed in blood. We marched across his fields, and the earth shook beneath the boots of thousands. Smoke rose wherever we passed, not because we needed to burn, but because fire speaks louder than any envoy. When we reached Edmund's hall, he came forth with priests at his side, clutching a jewelled cross as though it were a shield. His lips moved with prayers, and he begged for mercy in the name of a God who did not know me. I told him what I had told all men who thought their faith could buy them safety. Your God did not save Ragnar from the serpent pit. He will not save you from me. My warriors roared at my words, their shields beating like drums of doom. Edmund, pale but unyielding, answered, "I will not betray my Christ. Do what you must." So I did. We bound him to a tree, his arms stretched wide like the figure he worshipped. Arrows flew, darkening the sky. One by one they struck him, pinning him in place, his blood streaking down his robes like paint upon an altar. Still he prayed, whispering words I could not understand, until the last shaft silenced him. His death was not quick, and his kingdom's spirit died with him. The people of East Anglia fell like wheat before the scythe. Villages opened their gates, towns bent their knees, and warriors threw down their spears rather than face us. With their king nailed to the earth, there was no banner to rally beneath, no voice to command them. We seized their stores, their horses, their land. Winter came, and we did not retreat across the sea as raiders had before. We stayed, building halls upon their soil, feasting from their harvest, claiming their women and their wealth. My brothers exulted in the spoils, yet I saw more than plunder. I saw foundation. East Anglia was not merely defeated, it was consumed. Its fields now fed our army, its horses carried our warriors, its silver filled our coffers. We were not guests upon the land, we were its new masters. The Saxons began to murmur of me as more than a raider. They called me conqueror, lord, even king. I did not need their words, but I welcomed their fear. For with East Anglia crushed, the truth was clear. England was not a place to raid and leave. It was a land to claim, and I, Ivar the Boneless, would be the one to claim it. The raiders of old knew one rhythm: strike in summer, retreat in winter. They feared the cold and the hunger it brought, and so each year they carried their spoils back across the sea, leaving the Saxons to breathe easier until the thaw. But I was not content with rhythms set by others. I looked upon England's wide fields, its forests thick with deer, its villages fat with grain, and I saw not a land to be plundered and abandoned, but a land to be held. So when the first frosts silvered the earth, and the breath of men hung in the air like smoke, I gave an order no Viking host had dared before. We would stay. My brothers stared at me as if I were mad. Uber bared his teeth, reminding me that no army had ever wintered in a foreign land and thrived. Halfdan scoffed, saying warriors would lose heart if they could not return home to boast of their spoils. Even Sigurd, who often saw the sense in my words, asked quietly if the men would obey. I answered them all the same. Do you not see? If we leave, the Saxons will mend their walls, fill their stores, and rally their kings. If we remain, we cut their heart from their chest. Winter is not our enemy. It will be our ally, for the Saxons fear it more than we do. And so we dug in. Villages we had emptied of Saxon folk became our homes. We reinforced their halls, stored our grain, salted our meat. Horses were kept in stables that once belonged to English lords, their banners torn down and replaced with ours. Where once church bells rang, now our horns sounded. The land itself seemed to groan as it bent beneath our weight. The men muttered at first, restless, their hands itching for the sea. Yet, as days passed and the fires burned warm, they began to see the wisdom in my command. They drank from Saxon cups, slept beneath Saxon roofs, and took Saxon wives to their beds. The land fed them well, and soon they laughed at the thought of sailing home hungry when plenty lay all around. The Saxons, meanwhile, were struck dumb with fear. They had always known we would depart when the snow came, that they needed only endure until spring. Now they realized the storm would not pass. Their fields were ours, their villages ours, their land no longer their own. The dread of our permanence was greater than the dread of our raids. That winter was long, and the winds cut like knives across the fields. Yet while the Saxons cowered, we thrived. Our army grew fat with strength, our coffers heavy with silver, our hearts hardened with the knowledge that England itself had become our hearth. From that winter onward, the great heathen army was no longer a raiding host. It was a nation in motion, a kingdom carried on the shoulders of warriors. And I, crippled though I was, had bound it to the soil of England like roots digging into earth. The great army was vast, but it was not one beast with a single heart. It was a pack, and each of my brothers sought to be its head. Ubba was strength itself, eager to smash kingdoms with the weight of his axe. Halfdan dreamed of carving new lands for himself, eager to plant his banner over every hall we took. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, quiet and sharp, wove his own nets of alliances, seeking to turn enemies into pawns. And I, though they mocked me as boneless, I was the voice that bound them together, the iron thread through the cloth of chaos. There were nights when we quarrelled until the rafters shook, Ubba slammed his fist on the table, shouting that we should march west and take Mercia by storm. Halfdan shouted back, demanding we strike Wessex before it could gather strength. Sigurd counselled patience, pointing out the cracks in Saxon unity, urging us to wait and let them destroy one another. I listened, silent at first, letting their voices clash like steel. Then, when the noise was greatest, I spoke. "Divide, and we fail," I told them. "Each kingdom is strong in its own right, but together we are stronger. You would break them with rage, Ubba. You would seize their halls, Halfdan. You would bind them with treaties, Sigurd. Alone, each path falters. Together, they become a net no king can escape." They glared at me, but they knew the truth of it. Our father Ragnar had been one man, mighty and daring, but he had died alone in a pit of serpents. We were four, bound by blood, and blood could accomplish what a single man could not. So, we divided our strength not to weaken, but to conquer. Ubba led swift raids westward, burning towns until Mercia trembled. Halfdan pressed north, carving paths of terror into lands that had once defied us. Sigurd sought out Saxon nobles, offering silver and safety to those willing to betray their kin. And I, though my body could not ride nor march, remained the centre, the voice that gave order to chaos, weaving their separate paths into one great snare. The Saxons did not understand how to fight us. They tried to strike Ubba, and Halfdan crushed them from the other side. They sought to bribe Sigurd, not knowing that I had already twisted their gifts to our purpose. They mocked me still, calling me cripple, serpent, demon. Yet, each time they raised their banners, they found themselves caught in our web, their lines broken, their lands burning. At night, when the army feasted, we raised our horns together, brothers, who had once mocked and quarrelled, now bound by the blood we spilled as one. The men roared with us, for they saw the strength in our unity, and fear spread further across England. We were sons of Ragnar, each with our own hunger, but together we were more than raiders, more than kings. We were a storm, a tide of iron and fire. Bound by blood, we would tear England apart until nothing remained but our will. After York had fallen and East Anglia had been broken, we turned our eyes toward Mercia, that proud Saxon kingdom which lay between the rivers. It was ruled by King Burgred, a man who wrapped himself in piety and alliance, but who lacked the steel to face us. He thought himself clever, thought that by joining hands with Wessex he could withstand the storm. But storms do not bend to prayer or treaty. They break whatever stands against them. We marched in the dead of winter, our host so vast that the ground shook beneath its passage. Men whispered that we were as countless as the leaves of summer, our banners black with ravens blotting out the sky. Nottingham rose ahead, its walls stout, its towers bristling with defenders. Smoke curled from its chimneys, a sign that the people had huddled inside, clutching food and prayer beads, hoping to outlast us. They did not yet understand that patience was our greatest weapon. We encircled the city, digging trenches and raising fortifications of our own. No man or beast left those gates without our leave. We cut their lines of supply, poisoned the streams, and let hunger gnaw at their bellies while fear gnawed at their minds. My brothers paced like wolves, eager to strike, but I kept them leashed. "Let the city rot from within," I told them. Every day they remain behind those walls. Their strength fades. Every day we remain outside, ours grows. Still, the Saxons did not break easily. Their priests carried relics along the ramparts, lifting crosses high, chanting their Latin spells. Arrows rained down from the battlements, and many of our men fell. Yet for every man who died, 2 more arrived, eager for silver, eager for vengeance. And all the while, the Saxons' granaries emptied, their water fouled, their courage frayed. At last, the Mercian king sent word to Wessex, begging Alfred and his kin for aid. Armies marched to his side, but when they reached Nottingham, they did not fight. They saw the size of our host, the discipline of our lines, the hunger in our eyes, and they faltered. Instead of battle, they offered silver piles of it, more than most men could dream of in 10 lifetimes. They paid us not to slaughter them, not to burn their city to the ground. Some of my brothers grumbled at this, for they craved blood more than gold. But I laughed, for tribute is a greater victory than battle. Blood costs men, but silver strengthens the hand that wields it. We accepted their treasure, feasted upon it, and left Nottingham not in defeat, but in triumph. For the Saxons had shown their weakness. They would rather pay to be spared than fight to the death. That is when I knew Mercia's heart had already broken. The walls of Nottingham still stood, its churches still rang their bells, but its spirit was ash. Tribute is not mercy, it is proof of fear. And fear was the kingdom I was building, stone by stone, coin by coin. It was in Wessex that we first met a foe unlike the others. The Saxons of Northumbria had been divided, East Anglia had been soft, Mercia had bent beneath silver. But in Wessex, a young prince rose to meet us, a man the Saxons would come to call Alfred. He was not yet crowned, not yet hardened by years of rule, but already there was a fire in him that burned steadier than most kings. We swept into his lands as we had others, burning fields, seizing villages, striking terror before our banners. Alfred's brother, King Ethelred, led their host against us, but the prince was always there, close at hand, his eyes sharp, his words steady. I watched him from afar, studying how he moved among his men. Unlike other Saxon lords, he did not sit aloof in safety. He walked their lines, spoke to them, prayed with them. His presence steadied them, like a stake driven deep into earth against the pull of the storm. When our shield walls clashed at Reading, I thought them brittle, as all Saxons were. Yet they held, their spears thrusting with grim discipline, their songs of Christ rising above the roar. We pressed them hard, axes biting, arrows darkening the sky. Still they stood, and Alfred moved among them, like a boar cornered, fierce and unyielding, his voice carrying above the din. They did not break as others had, they bent and bent again, but each time they straightened, bloodied yet unbroken. It was a strange feeling, to taste resistance not born of arrogance or greed, but of something deeper. The Saxons of Wessex fought not only for land, but for faith, for hearth, for a future they believed their God had promised. I had seen men fight for plunder, for vengeance, for glory, but this was different. Their fear of us was there. Yes, it was in their eyes when they looked upon our raven banners, but they turned that fear into defiance. For the first time, I found myself respecting an enemy. Not admiring, not forgiving, but respecting. Alfred was clever. When he could not meet us in the open, he retreated into marshes and woods, forcing us to seek him where the land itself fought at his side. When he could not strike at our strength, he struck at our supplies, our scouts, our messengers. He moved like a fox, sharp and elusive, always slipping through fingers that thought they had closed around him. I told my brothers that this Alfred was not to be dismissed. Mark him, I warned. He is not like Ella, nor Edmund, nor Burgred. He will not buy peace with silver, nor fall easily to terror. If we falter, he will be the one to drive us into the sea. They scoffed, eager as ever for the clash of arms. But I remembered the seer's words that my thread would be woven against kings. I knew then that Alfred was one such king, and that our fates would be bound together. He was young still, but already I could feel the weight of his resistance pressing against my vengeance. And though I would not yet admit it aloud, a part of me knew. Here, at last, was an enemy worthy of fear. When the horns of war called, my brothers mounted their horses and strode at the head of their men, their armour glinting, their steps bold and sure. I, the boneless, could not rise to march beside them. My legs lay twisted beneath me, brittle as withered reeds, yet I would not be left behind. I was carried upon a shield, lifted on the shoulders of warriors who feared me more than they pitied me, or else drawn in a cart, its wheels iron-bound, creaking across the frozen earth. At first, some mocked this sight, the cripple riding to battle, while others bled at the front. But when the clash came, when the shield walls ground together like grinding stones, it was my voice that rose above the thunder. I shouted commands with a fury that made men forget my twisted frame. To them, I became a force larger than bone and blood, a presence that guided them like the hand of Odin himself. I remember one march through the Midlands, the land soaked by rain, the earth clinging to boots like tar. The Saxons thought the weather would slow us, that our wagons would sink, that I would be left stranded in the muck. Yet I pressed forward, urging the men with words sharper than whips. If I, who cannot walk, can move through this mire, how can you, who stand tall, falter? They roared in answer, ashamed to show weakness before the cripple who would not yield. In battle, I became a sight of terror. My cart rolled into the fray, my shield raised before me, my spear balanced across my knees. Warriors formed around me like a living wall, their faith tied to my voice. Saxons, seeing me borne aloft, whispered of witchcraft, of a demon who rode to war, though his legs were broken. Some claimed I could not be killed, that the gods had made me untouchable. I used their fear as my weapon. I dressed myself in cloaks dyed deep with crimson, so that my presence was unmistakable upon the field. I had the heads of wolves nailed to the sides of my cart, their fangs bared, their eyes glassy, a vision of dread rolling through the smoke. When I pointed my spear, men moved as though commanded by the gods. When I raised my voice, axes fell in perfect rhythm, and though I could not swing my body into the shield wall, I was there in every victory. Each Saxon who fled, each fortress that fell, each tribute paid, they carried my mark upon them. Warriors began to whisper that my crippled body was no weakness at all, but proof that the gods had chosen me for something greater. I could not walk the earth as other men did, but kingdoms trembled where my cart rolled. The Saxons came to know this truth. Though my legs were broken, my will marched farther than any man's stride, and it would not stop until their land was broken beneath me. The Saxons believed our strength endless, but even the fiercest wolf must feed, and even an army as vast as ours required wealth to hold it together. Silver bought loyalty, ships carried food, and men followed those who could promise both. To bind our power more tightly, I turned my gaze westward, across the sea to the kingdom of Dublin. Dublin was no simple settlement of huts and fields. It was a fortress of trade, a city where Norsemen ruled over a river of silver and slaves. There, sea kings fought like wolves over scraps of power, their alliances shifting as quickly as the tides. Olaf the White, a man as cunning as he was ambitious, reigned in those days. He welcomed me not as cripple but as equal, for he saw in my name the weight of terror that already stretched across England. I remember the first time I was carried through Dublin's gates, the smell of salt and tar, thick in the air, the clamour of markets, filled with foreign tongues, Gaelic, Norse, Saxon, even the sharp syllables of traders from as far as Francia. Men gawked at me as I passed, some pitying, others whispering that this was the boneless one who had broken York and carved open Ella. Their eyes followed me not for weakness but for power. In Dublin's halls, alliances were sealed over mead and steel. I joined Olaf in feasts, where the benches strained beneath warriors drunk on ambition. Together, we plotted raids upon the coasts of Ireland and beyond. Dublin's wealth poured into my coffers, silver and cattle, and thralls enough to keep my warriors fed and my ships afloat. The Saxons thought me bound to their soil, but they did not know my roots reached farther, fed by the lifeblood of many shores. Yet, Dublin was not only a source of wealth, it was a mirror. In its tangled rivalries, I saw what our great army might become if we were not bound together. I watched sea kings rise in the morning and fall before night, their heads dashed upon rocks of betrayal. I learned that kingdoms are not toppled only by swords, but by greed, by envy, by brothers who would rather cut each other's throats than stand united. At night, When the feasting was done and the fires burned low, I considered the shadow Dublin cast. It reminded me that my own brothers, Uba, Halfdan, Sigurd, were each wolves with their own hunger. For now we were bound by blood and vengeance, but I knew a day would come when the weight of silver and land would test our unity. Still, Dublin strengthened me. From its harbours I drew ships enough to darken horizons. From its markets I drew wealth to bind warriors to my cause. From its halls I drew lessons in both power and peril. When I left its shores to return to England, the sea spray stinging my face, I carried Dublin's shadow with me, not as burden, but as shield. For with its wealth and its warnings, I knew I could stretch my hand farther, clutch tighter, and strike harder at the Saxons who still clung to hope. From Dublin, we set our sights farther north, to a place where the Britons had long defied both Norse and Saxon, Dumbarton Rock. It rose from the Clyde like a fortress carved by the gods themselves, a jagged crag surrounded by water, its walls sheer and high, its people proud. For centuries it had been a stronghold of the Strathclyde Britons, a bastion said to be unassailable. But nothing built by men is beyond breaking, and I swore that even this rock would bow before me. We sailed up the western seas, with ships heavy with warriors and engines of war. The river narrowed, its waters dark and cold, and ahead the rock loomed, crowned with walls that clung like a hawk's nest to the cliff. The defenders jeered from above, shouting in a tongue harsh and strange, casting down stones as if their laughter alone could hold us back. I ordered the camp built around the base, cutting off every path of escape. Our fires ringed the fortress like a necklace of flame. We brought up our siege engines, battering rams wrapped in hides, great slings that hurled stones against their walls. Day after day we struck, the clang of iron echoing against the rock. Yet Dumbarton stood, as immovable as the mountain it rose from. So I turned to hunger, my oldest ally. We sealed the fortress, watching from below as their stores dwindled. Weeks turned into months. The defenders drank from rain and river, ate their horses and dogs, boiled leather to soften their famine. Their shouts grew weaker, their jeers fell silent, and their torches burned less brightly each night. My men grew restless, but I calmed them with words. Let time be our blade. Every day we wait, the rock itself fights with us. At last, after 4 long months, the fortress cracked. A gate opened not with defiance, but with despair. The defenders stumbled out, gaunt as spectres, their eyes hollow, their bodies trembling from starvation. They could no longer lift sword nor spear. We fell upon them like wolves. Some we cut down where they stood, others we bound in chains. The once proud stronghold was stripped bare, its halls echoing with the cries of the conquered. We looted Dumbarton of everything it had hoarded, gold, cattle, weapons, but above all, men and women. Thousands were taken as captives, driven in chains to the markets of Dublin, sold across the seas to fill the coffers of our host. The fortress that had stood for centuries now fed the very army that would carry war deeper into England. When I looked upon Dumbarton's broken walls, I felt no pity. The Britons had boasted their fortress was eternal, yet it fell as all things fall. I raised my hand to the sky and swore before gods and men, no stronghold, no king, no kingdom was beyond my reach. If a rock could fall, then so too would the crowns of England. The siege of Dumbarton was not only victory, it was proof. The world itself could be broken, if one had the will to wait, the mind to plan, and the heart to see it through. Wherever our banners flew, men learned quickly that we brought not only fire and plunder, but also law, our law. It was not written in parchment or carved into stone. It was carved into flesh, hammered into skulls, and spoken in voices that could not be ignored. For the Saxons, justice was bound to the cross and to councils of kings. For us, it was bound to steel. When we settled in East Anglia, then in York, I saw the danger of leaving men to think they could live as before. Tribute and obedience were not enough. To rule, we needed order, and order had to be enforced. I decreed that theft among our ranks would be punished by the severing of hands. Cowardice in battle would be answered with death, swift and public. Adultery brought shame, and shame was washed away only in blood. These judgments were not new inventions of mine. They were the customs of our people, carried in memory and saga. But I sharpened them, made them visible, and made certain that every man, woman, and thrall knew what fate awaited those who transgressed. I remember the first thief caught in York. He was a Dane, one of our own, who had stolen silver from his comrades. Some argued he should be spared, that it was a small crime. I ordered his hand struck off before the gathered host. His scream echoed through the streets, and when he stumbled away, clutching his stump, blood trailing behind him, no man doubted my word again. Fear is a hard teacher, but it is the only one men truly remember. The Saxons learned too. Once, a priest caught in our new dominion spoke against us, telling his flock that Christ would smite the heathens and that their true king would return. I had him dragged before the crowd, his vestments torn, his cross snapped. Your Christ did not save Edmund, I told him. He will not save you. Then I ordered him hanged from the church he had once served. From that day forward, the bells rang only when I permitted. But law was not only punishment, it was also protection. Under my rule, a man's cattle could not be stolen without retribution. A woman wronged could demand compensation. A warrior who fought bravely could expect his share of silver, whether born Dane or Saxon. Some grumbled, but most obeyed, for they saw the fairness beneath the iron. Even Saxons, once they understood the rules, bent their heads and lived beneath them. I knew then that conquest was more than fire and steel. It was shaping men to your will, binding them to fear and to the promise of order. The Saxons called us heathens, but they came to understand, under my hand there was law, and that law was the sword. It was this law, brutal yet unyielding, that allowed us to remain. Without it, our great army would have splintered, greed and envy devouring us from within. With it, we stood as one, united by terror, bound by blood, and governed by the will of Ivar the Boneless. If my legs were withered, my will was not. The warriors who carried me on shields grew weary, though they dared not say it. So I ordered something new, something that would make my weakness into a weapon. I had the smiths of York and Dublin fashion me a war chariot, its wheels bound in iron, its frame carved with runes, its yoke drawn not by horses, but by men chosen for their strength and loyalty. When I was set upon it, spear across my lap, cloak billowing, I was no longer a cripple. I was a storm upon wheels. The first time I rolled into battle in that chariot, the Saxons faltered. They had expected to see me carried like a child, a burden upon others. Instead, they saw me borne forward like a god of vengeance, my cart rattling over the earth, my eyes fixed upon them with the fury of Odin's own. The wolves' heads I had nailed to its sides gleamed with dried blood, their fangs bared in eternal snarl. Behind me, the raven banner whipped in the wind. The Saxons whispered that I was not human, but some cursed spirit conjured from the pit. Their fear was my chariot's second set of wheels, carrying me faster than any horse. My men learned to move with me, to use the chariot as the beating heart of our army. I pointed with my spear, and they shifted like a living tide. I shouted a single word, and shield walls bent and folded at my command. The rattle of my wheels became as familiar as the clash of iron, a sound that told them where their commander stood. Some claimed they fought harder when they saw me roll among them, as if my presence turned their arms to iron. Not all understood at first. Ubba laughed when he saw me climb into the cart. A child's toy, he said, though even he stopped laughing when he saw Saxon warriors scatter at the sight of it. Halfdan shrugged, unconvinced, until he noticed how my men fought like wolves whenever my wheels cut the field beside them. Sigurd alone gave a sly smile, for he knew that terror itself is the greatest weapon of all. One Saxon chronicler later wrote that, "I rode into battle like a spectre, my chariot rumbling, my cries unearthly. He called me monstrum, a monster. I smile even now at the word, for it gave me what I wanted. To my men, I was leader. To my enemies, I was nightmare. Both truths served me well. The chariot became more than transport. It was my throne in war, my body made terrible, my voice given wheels. The Saxons saw it and lost heart. My men saw it and gained courage. I, who could not take a single step unaided, now strode across the battlefield as surely as any king. Thus, what they called my curse became my crown. The cripple's chariot was not a symbol of weakness. It was the shape of my dominion, rolling ever forward, crushing kingdoms beneath its wheels. After York was taken, after Edmund's body had been nailed with arrows, after Nottingham's tribute filled our coffers, there remained Mercia, proud Mercia, the kingdom at England's heart. Its rivers fed the land, its halls gleamed with wealth, its lords had long claimed power over all Saxons. But pride without iron is nothing. Mercia was a tree already hollowed by rot, and all I needed to do was press my weight against it until it toppled. We marched south and west, our banners black with ravens, our chariots rolling like thunder across the muddy tracks. Villages fell silent before we reached them. Doors stood open, food left upon tables, livestock wandering without herdsmen. The people fled to their towns and fortresses, clinging to walls they thought would save them. Yet walls mean nothing when an army has already broken the land around them. King Burgred of Mercia did not come to meet us in the field. Instead, he sent priests and envoys, their hands heavy with crosses, their tongues heavy with pleas. They spoke of peace, of gold, of alliance. My brothers listened with smirks, and I said nothing at first, letting the silence weigh upon them. Then I told the envoys, "Your king hides behind prayers because he has no steel. A lord who cannot face his foes does not rule, he squats upon land waiting to be taken." The envoys trembled, for they knew these words were true. Still, we did not rush to finish Mercia. I starved it, as I had starved Dumbarton. I spread our hosts across its fields, seizing harvests, taking cattle, burning what we did not need. Hunger entered the Mercian villages before our warriors did. The people cursed their king, blaming him for inviting wolves by failing to act. Fear is a sword that cuts deeper than iron, and soon Mercia's strength was bleeding out without a battle. At last Burgred fled, abandoning his throne, his crown, and his people. He scuttled south, seeking refuge in Wessex like a rat fleeing fire. Mercia lay leaderless, its lords scrambling to save themselves. Some bent their knees before us, offering oaths in exchange for land. Others we cut down, their heads displayed upon spears at their own gates. When the smoke cleared, Mercia was ours, not shattered by one great clash, but strangled slowly, its pride drained like blood from a wound. We placed a puppet upon its throne, a man willing to bend to our will, to pay tribute and keep the peace in our name. To the Saxons, Mercia still seemed alive, its halls filled, its crown gleaming. But I knew the truth. It was a corpse dressed in fine clothes, its voice nothing more than an echo of mine. With Mercia fallen, England itself was cleft open. From the north to the centre, our dominion stretched like a black river. Wessex alone remained strong, the young Prince Alfred still prowling like a boar in his marshes. But Mercia's fall proved what I had always known. Kingdoms break not only from swords at their gates, but from weakness at their heart. And I, Ivar the Boneless, was the hand that pressed until Mercia crumbled into dust. Among the many terrors we carried across England, none was more feared than the Raven Banner. My mother, Aslaug, had woven it with her own hands, stitching prophecy into every thread. She said the banner bore the eye of Odin, and wherever it flew, victory would follow, though the one who carried it was often marked for death. My brother Ubba claimed it for his own, and from that moment he became the living shadow of its power. The standard was black as storm clouds, the raven at its centre painted in strokes that seemed to writhe when the wind caught them. When it unfurled above the shield wall, men swore the bird itself moved, its wings beating, its beak dripping with hunger. Saxons who saw it lost heart before a single blow was struck, believing Odin's eye stared into their souls. To them, it was not cloth, it was doom. Ubba bore it proudly, his great frame striding into battle with the banner high, his axe gleaming in the other hand. He was the embodiment of Viking strength, a warrior who laughed in the thick of slaughter, whose blows could break a man in two. When he raised the raven standard, our warriors roared as if the gods themselves shouted through their throats. Victory clung to him like a cloak, and where he marched, kingdoms faltered. I, though boneless, understood the banner better than Ubba did. It was not the gods alone who made men quake, it was belief. The Saxons believed the raven foretold their death, and so they lost before they fought. My warriors believed Odin watched from its wings, and so they fought harder than mortal men. Faith and fear, these were the true threads woven into the cloth, stronger than wool, sharper than steel. One battle stands etched in my mind. We faced a Saxon host upon a hillside, their shield wall braced, their banners stiff in the cold wind. They had numbers enough to stand against us, and their priests shouted prayers with every thrust of their spears. But when Ubba raised the raven banner, a murmur swept through their ranks. Some faltered, others broke and fled, dropping shields in their haste. By the time steel met steel, their courage had already died. The hillside ran red, and the raven fed well that day. Yet I also knew the banner's curse. Carriers seldom lived long, for the gods demanded sacrifice for such power. Ubba himself seemed marked, though he laughed at the thought, calling it nothing but skald's talk. Still, when I looked at him holding that banner, proud and unyielding, I wondered if he carried not only our mother's gift, but his own fate upon his shoulders. The Saxons came to dread Ubba's standard more than any sword. In their chronicles, they wrote of it as if it were alive, a demon of cloth and wind. And in truth, it was alive not with magic, but with fear, the greatest force in all war. With Ubba's raven flying high, the great army's shadow darkened England, and the Saxons learned that even the sky itself seemed to fight for us. While Mercia bent beneath our yoke and Ubba's raven banner darkened the skies, one thorn remained fixed deep in our side, Alfred of Wessex. When his brother Ethelred still lived, Alfred had been the shadow at his shoulder, the quiet counsellor, the cunning prince. But Ethelred's death left him king, and though young, Alfred proved himself more resilient than any Saxon lord we had faced. We struck at Wessex with the full weight of our host, axes flashing, shield walls grinding. Towns fell, churches burned, villages emptied before us. Alfred met us in battle more than once, his men clashing hard against ours. Yet each time, though blood ran freely, he slipped away before the killing blow could fall. He fought like the boar the Saxons named him after, not graceful, not clever in form, but stubborn, relentless, impossible to kill outright. Then came the winter, when Alfred's fortune seemed broken. Defeated, pursued, he vanished into the marshlands of Somerset. To most kings, such exile would mean the end. But Alfred was not like other kings. In the swamps and fens, where the earth itself sucked at boots and the fog swallowed sound, he endured. He gathered to him what remained of his people, farmers, outlaws, men too stubborn to bend. There in the reeds, with water lapping at his hall of mud and thatch, he kept his crown alive. Scouts whispered of him, telling tales that should have sounded like defeat. He lived like a hunted animal, his cloak ragged, his meals meagre. Yet those who followed him swore that his spirit did not dim. They said he prayed by firelight, his voice steady, his gaze unbroken. From that mire, Alfred forged not despair, but resolve. He trained his ragged followers, struck at our scouts, harried our supply lines. Like gnats they stung, and though each sting was small, together they became a nuisance that could not be ignored. My brothers laughed at the thought of a king hiding in a swamp. Ubba called him a rat, Halfdan a coward. Even Sigurd, who usually saw the weight of things, dismissed Alfred's refuge as a dying ember. But I listened to the whispers and knew better. A rat can bite when cornered. A dying ember can set fields aflame if given breath. I told them, "Mark this, Alfred. He is no Ella, no Edmund, no Burgred. He will rise again, and if we do not break him utterly, he will one day break us." They scoffed, eager to move on to easier prey. Yet in my heart I felt the tug of fate. The seer had spoken long ago that my thread would be woven against kings, and I knew Alfred was one such thread. In the marshes of Somerset, among reeds and bog water, Alfred clung to life, and from that mud he would rise, stronger for the suffering, sharper for the hunger. Ivar the Boneless had broken many kingdoms, but in that swamp a king was learning how to endure me. The winter mists lay heavy on the hills when we marched to Ashdown. The Saxons had gathered again, their firds swollen with men, called from plough and hearth. And Alfred, the young boar of Wessex, stood among them. He was no longer the hunted prince in the marshes. He was a king now, his banner raised, his men chanting prayers as if Christ himself would stand in their shield wall. We met them at dawn, the sky pale and cold, the ground slick with frost. Our lines stretched wide, shields locked, spears bristling. The raven banner flew high above us, its wings snapping in the wind. From where I sat in my chariot, I watched the Saxons arrange themselves, clumsy but determined, their priests walking the ranks with crosses raised. My warriors laughed, but I told them to still their tongues. "Mock not a foe who has nothing left to lose," I warned. The clash came like thunder. Shields smashed, axes rose and fell, the air filled with the cries of men locked in death's embrace. My brothers waded into the fray, Ubba's axe carving bloody arcs, Halfdan roaring like a bear, Sigurd's serpent eye glinting with cold fury. I bellowed commands, urging our shield wall to press, to grind, to break the Saxon line. The earth shook with the weight of bodies, the stench of blood rising like steam into the morning. At first, the Saxons faltered, as they always had, but Alfred rallied them. I saw him through the haze, his sword flashing, his cloak torn, his face streaked with sweat and blood. He moved among his men not as a king above them, but as a warrior beside them, striking when they wavered, shouting when they faltered. Each time their line bent, he straightened it. Each time they staggered, he set them firm again. The battle raged from dawn until midday, the shield walls grinding like millstones. At last our strength pressed through. The Saxon right collapsed, their men scattering down the slope. Then the rest began to break, their prayers turning to screams, their banners trampled in the mud. We surged forward, cutting them down as they fled. The ravens circled above, their cries mingling with the roar of my warriors. The field became a feast, their beaks tearing at Saxon flesh even before the bodies cooled. When the slaughter ended, the hillside was carpeted with the dead. The blood ran in rivulets, black in the winter light. The ravens gorged themselves until their wings were heavy, their feathers slick with gore. My men cheered, raising horns, shouting Ragnar's name, shouting mine. The Saxons had fought with fury, but they had been broken all the same. Yet I did not smile. Victory was ours, yes, but I had seen Alfred in the storm. He had stood where others fled, held where others broke. He had tasted defeat, but not ruin, and I knew he would rise again. The ravens feasted that day, but their hunger was never sated. Neither, I thought, was Alfred's will. The field of Ashdown was ours, yet in the cries of the ravens I heard not only triumph, but warning. After Ashdown, when the ground was still dark with Saxon blood, the land did not settle into peace. No, the clash of shield walls had shown all of England that we were more than raiders, we were lords, and lords demand tribute. From that moment, our conquests became not only battles of iron, but also battles of silver and betrayal. Saxon kings had always feared us, but now they learned that fear could be measured in coins. Some fought and died, others bent the knee and filled our chests with gold and silver. Each bag of coin we claimed was another blow against their pride, another proof that we were masters of their fate. They thought tribute would buy them time, that it would turn our rage aside. But I knew the truth. Tribute was not peace. It was surrender, disguised as bargain. There was one lord of Mercia who came to me in secret. His name is not worth remembering, for he was like many others, hungry for power, too weak to seize it openly. He came crawling with gifts, offering me the lives of his rivals in exchange for my protection. I listened to him with a still face, though inside I laughed. He thought himself clever, but he was nothing more than a pawn placing his own neck in my hand. I gave him my word, and my brothers gave him their axes. By dawn, his rivals lay headless, and he thought himself king. But in truth, he was my servant, his crown resting on the tip of my spear. Such betrayals spread like fire. Saxons turned against Saxons, priests against priests, each man desperate to save himself, even if it meant damning his neighbour. I nurtured this division, fanning it like a flame. I sent word to one that his enemy had already bent the knee, to another that his ally had betrayed him. Soon they fought each other with the same ferocity they once reserved for us, and while they bled, we grew rich. My brothers sometimes scorned this way of war. Ubba longed for the clean work of axe against shield. Halfdan grew restless, saying silver was not glory. Yet I knew better. For every coin we took, another Saxon hall weakened. For every man who betrayed his kin, another link in their chain snapped. Fear was still my sharpest weapon, but silver was the whetstone that kept it keen. In the Saxon chronicles, they cursed us for greed. They said we loved gold more than blood. But they did not see the truth. Gold buys spears, gold feeds men, gold makes kings kneel, where swords alone cannot. Tribute bound England tighter to us than any battle. By the time spring returned, England was not merely broken by war, it was broken by mistrust. Coins clinked louder than prayers, and betrayal rang louder than bells. I had turned their own greed against them, and each Saxon lord who came crawling with silver only knelt deeper in the shadow of Ivar the Boneless. The blood of Ragnar ran hot in each of us, but never in the same way. Ubba's fire was rage, Halfdan's pride was hunger, Sigurd's cunning was venom, and mine was the will to bind them all. For years we had fought as one, our vengeance driving us like a storm across England. Yet once the great oaths were satisfied, once Ella's ribs were cracked open and Edmund lay riddled with arrows, cracks began to form among us. Ubba desired endless war. His axe had tasted too much blood, and he could not imagine a life without the roar of shield walls. To him, peace was weakness, tribute a coward's prize. He wanted to push ever westward, to grind Wessex beneath our boots and drive our banners to the edge of the sea. Halfdan saw things differently. He was tired of marching, tired of sleeping in fields and feasting in stolen halls. He dreamed of land, of fields tilled by his thralls, of a kingdom to call his own. He whispered of Northumbria, of carving farms from its soil, and turning from raider to lord. To him, war was a path to settlement, and he grew restless with those who saw no end to it. Sigurd, the serpent-eyed, was quieter, but his mind was always at work. He preferred silver to slaughter, alliances to open battle. He saw kings who might be bent rather than broken, priests who might spread fear without us raising a hand. He spoke of treaties, of using Saxons against Saxons, weaving nets of intrigue until they strangled themselves. And I, though I could not walk, stood at the centre of it all. My will was not for plunder, nor for farms, nor for fragile alliances. My will was for dominion. I wanted England itself, not in part, but in whole. To settle was to rest, to raid without end was to squander, to trust in alliances was to gamble. Only iron discipline, forged by fear and bound by law, could hold what we had taken. Only my voice, sharper than steel, could keep the host together. But my brothers did not see it so. Around the fire we quarrelled, voices rising like thunder, hands tightening on axe hilts. Once Halfdan called me a cripple who dreamed too large, and Uber roared that fear alone could not win battles. Sigurd smirked, speaking of poison in cups, of whispers stronger than swords. The men watched us with wary eyes, for they knew that if Ragnar's sons turned upon each other, the host itself might shatter. Yet even in division, we could not break apart completely. Blood bound us. When the war horns sounded, we fought side by side, for no Saxon was strong enough to drive a wedge between us on the field. But off the field, in the silence of the longhouse, the cracks widened. Each of us dreamed of a different England, and though we still raised our horns together, the sagas had already begun to whisper of brothers divided. The great army still roared, but within it the seeds of discord were sown, and I knew well, the Norns do not weave harmony, they weave fate with knots of blood, and our blood was beginning to tangle. After the quarrels with my brothers, after the endless marches, and the silver paid by broken kings, I returned to York. It was no longer the proud Saxon stronghold we had once besieged. Now it bore the scars of conquest, its walls patched, its streets scarred by fire. Yet it stood, and within its stone embrace I took my seat, not as raider, not as avenger, but as ruler. The people of York were Saxon and Dane alike, their tongues clashing in the markets, their prayers rising to different gods. Fear had kept them quiet at first, but fear alone cannot hold a city forever. So, I set about shaping York into something new. I declared laws, harsh but clear. Theft was punished swiftly, murder by blood price, rebellion by the noose. Many cursed me, but none could deny the order it brought. Where once there had been chaos, now there was rhythm, trade in the markets, tolls at the gates, warriors paid in silver rather than in promise alone. I ruled from a hall of timber set within the old Roman walls. Each morning men came before me with disputes, a Dane demanding land from a Saxon woman begging justice for her slain husband, traders quarrelling over coin. I listened, judged, and passed sentence. Some were surprised that I would hear Saxons at all, but I knew that to rule was not only to command my own, it was to bind even the conquered to my will. York thrived beneath my hand. Merchants returned, their carts heavy with goods, for they knew my laws protected their wares. Smiths worked without pause, forging spearheads and mail. Ships came upriver, bearing grain and mead, their captains paying tribute gladly for the safety my warriors provided. Even the churches rang their bells again, though now their priests paid their dues in silver, and their crosses stood under my banner. Still, whispers followed me. The Saxons called me demon, cripple, tyrant. Some claimed I ruled through cruelty alone, but I knew better. Cruelty breaks men, law binds them, and though they hated me, they obeyed. Better a crippled ruler with iron will than no ruler at all. My brothers did not linger long. Ubba returned to his wars, Halfdan pressed north, Sigurd slithered into his alliances, but I remained. In York, I found what I had sought since the day of my birth, a throne that no one could deny me. I could not walk across the hall, yet kings and lords bent their heads when I spoke. As I looked out from the walls of York, watching the smoke of 1,000 hearths rise into the grey sky, I felt a strange stillness. This city, once Saxon, now bowed to me. The cripple who was meant to die at birth now ruled where others had fallen. York was no longer their city, it was mine. And through it, England itself began to take the shape of my will. Though York was mine, Though silver clinked in my coffers and men bent beneath my law, my gaze was never bound to one city. Power is like the tide. It must always move, or else it stagnates and recedes. And so, while my brothers quarrelled and Saxon kings schemed, I turned my eyes westward once more, across the grey sea, to Ireland. Ireland was no Saxon land of timid priests and divided kings. It was a patchwork of rival chieftains, each fierce, each hungry, each ready to betray the other for a taste of power. And on its eastern shore lay Dublin, a kingdom ruled by sea kings, half Norse, half Gaelic, whose ships prowled the western waters like wolves. Dublin was a prize, but it was also a key. Whoever held it commanded the trade of the seas, the flow of silver, the chains of captives that fed our markets. When I returned, carried ashore in my chariot, the people stared as they always did. Some sneered at my twisted legs, others whispered of the boneless one who had broken York and carved open kings. In their whispers, I heard both scorn and awe, and both served me well. For fear binds as tightly as respect, and I had long since learned to wield both. Olaf the White sat upon Dublin's throne then, a sea king of cunning ambition. We drank together, feasted together, and plotted together. He saw in me not a cripple, but a partner who could extend his reach beyond the Irish Sea. And I saw in him a source of ships, men, and wealth to strengthen my grip upon England. Our alliance was sealed not by parchment, but by mead, by silver, and by the promise of war. From Dublin we struck outward. The isles off Scotland bent beneath our sails, their people driven into slavery. Monasteries fell, their bells silenced, their gold torn from altars to line our halls. Even the Britons to the west felt our raids, their coasts aflame beneath the wings of my ravens. Each conquest swelled our coffers, and from those coffers I fed the great army, binding it closer to me. Yet Dublin was more than a forge of silver. It was a mirror. In its feasting halls, I saw the chaos that comes when kings cannot hold their warriors in check. Rival sea lords whispered behind Olaf's back, knives always ready to strike. Their world was a storm without anchor. I studied it closely, knowing that one day such storms would rise among my brothers. Ireland taught me what Saxons never could, that the greatest danger to a king is not his enemy, but his ally grown restless. So I tightened my grip upon Dublin's wealth, sending ships laden with silver, grain, and captives back across the sea. With every chain sold, with every coin struck, England grew more tightly bound to me. Ireland had beckoned, and I had answered not as raider, but as ruler. And I knew then, the sea did not divide kingdoms. It carried them into my grasp. By the time the snows thawed and the rivers loosened their icy grip, my name had already crossed the seas faster than any ship. In England, priests cursed it in their sermons, scribes inked it with trembling hands, and mothers used it to frighten their children into silence. In Ireland, rivals muttered it in jealousy, sea kings weighed it in fear, and traders whispered it over cups of mead. Even in Francia, where Charlemagne's heirs still clung to their crumbling empire, word of the boneless one spread, a crippled king who ruled as a giant. The Saxons called me demon. They said my body was proof of it, that no natural man could crawl from birth into power so vast. They told tales that I had no bones at all, that my body was jelly, that I slithered like a serpent and conjured fear with a glance. They said I drank the blood of kings and slept in a nest of skulls. Lies, yes, but lies that served me well. For each rumour, each story twisted into horror, made my enemies tremble before ever facing me. To my men, I was no demon but a chosen one. They believed Odin had marked me, stripping away my strength so I would lean only on cunning and will. They swore the raven banner flew stronger when raised in my name. Some claimed they had seen me glow in the firelight, my eyes burning like coals as I gave commands. They knelt when I passed, not because they were forced, but because they believed the gods had woven me into their fate. I understood what others did not. Terror is a currency richer than silver. Tribute may fill coffers, but fear fills armies. A man who fears you will obey faster than one who loves you. And so I cultivated my legend as carefully as a farmer tends his field. I allowed the rumors to spread, even fed them with hints and silences. I let prisoners return home bearing tales of my wrath, of the blood eagle, of the cripple who moved kingdoms with a word. They thought themselves lucky to live, not realizing they carried my terror into every hall they entered. One winter evening, a Saxon VGN was dragged before me, captured while spying on our camp. His face was pale, his body trembling. Before I spoke a word, he fell to his knees, babbling promises of gold, of loyalty, of betrayal against his own kin. I smiled and dismissed him with a wave. I did not need to spill his blood. His terror would do more for me alive than dead. Soon, even battles were won by fear before the first axe struck. Villages surrendered at the sight of my chariot. Gates opened at the whisper of my name. Kings bent their knees not because they lacked swords, but because they lacked the courage to raise them. And so, crippled though I was, I strode farther than any man of flesh and bone. My body was bent, but my name stood taller than walls, stronger than armies, more enduring than crowns. It was not gold, nor steel, nor even blood that made me great. It was terror, and terror bore my name, Ivar the Boneless. For many years I had carried my curse as though it were a crown. My twisted frame had not broken me, it had shaped me. Where others relied on strength of arm or speed of foot, I had relied on cunning, patience, and the sharp edge of fear. But time is a foe that no man conquers, not even the boneless. Slowly, quietly, my body began to betray me. At first, it was nothing more than pain, a deeper ache in my back when the nights turned cold, a stiffness in my arms when I gripped the spear too long. I ignored it, for pain had been my companion since birth. But the ache grew, gnawing at me like a wolf at the marrow. My hands cramped, my breath came shorter, and the strength I had once poured into words now took all I had simply to sit upright. My brothers noticed, though they did not speak of it at first. Ubba watched me with eyes that once burned with loyalty, now shadowed with doubt. Halfdan grew restless, whispering of new lands, while casting glances at me as though wondering if I would survive the march. Sigurd's serpent eye gleamed colder than ever, his silence sharper than mockery. They smelled weakness, and weakness was the one thing I had never allowed myself to show. I pushed harder, refusing to yield. I rode my chariot onto the field, my cloak heavy upon my shoulders, my spear balanced as though nothing had changed. My voice still carried, fierce and commanding, and the warriors still roared when I shouted, yet inside I felt the strain. Each word was fire in my chest, each gesture like lifting a boulder. When the battle ended, I collapsed into my furs, my body trembling, my breath ragged. The men did not see, but the gods surely did. I thought often of the Norns, the weavers of fate, and wondered if my thread had begun to fray. Was this the price for the power I had wielded? Had Odin marked me for glory, but decreed that my body would pay the debt in suffering? Even so, I refused to let the sickness define me. Pain sharpened me. It reminded me that time was short, that I must carve my mark deeper before the shadows closed in. I drove my men harder, seized more silver, demanded stricter obedience. If my body faltered, my will grew harsher to compensate. Some called me crueler in those years, but cruelty was the mask of necessity. At night, alone in my hall, I would stretch my twisted legs with my hands, forcing them straight until tears blurred my vision. Still they curled back, useless as driftwood, mocking me as they always had, and I whispered to myself, again and again, the bones betray me, but the will does not. Yet deep within, I knew the truth. The will was iron, but even iron rusts. My body, once the vessel of fear, was becoming my prison. And still, I swore I would not go quietly. If the Norns wove weakness into my final days, then I would weave terror into theirs. The years of conquest had left England scarred, its fields trampled, its villages burned, its kings either slain or bound to tribute. Yet as my body weakened, so too did the bonds of my dominion. Power that had once been absolute began to splinter. Enemies I had cowed with terror now rose again, sensing blood in the water. Allies I had bound with silver now tugged at their chains, eager to seize more than I could hold. Mercia, once broken, stirred with rebellion. Its lords whispered that the sons of Ragnar were divided, that Ivar the Boneless no longer struck with the same fury. They raised their banners in hidden valleys, calling upon the Saxons to cast off the yoke. Wessex, under Alfred, had not died in the marshes as many hoped. Instead, it grew stronger, fed by the dream that England could rise again beneath Christ's cross. Even Dublin, which had once filled my coffers, shifted in loyalty, its sea kings snarling over trade and turning their eyes upon my throne with envy. I remained in York, the seat I had carved from Saxon stone, watching as cracks spread through the kingdom I had forged. I ruled still, my word was law. My enemies trembled when I summoned them, but I could feel the tide turning. Silver flowed out faster than it flowed in. Men grew restless when battles stalled. The fear that had once made me a god now curdled into doubt. I tightened my rule as a dying man grips harder at his breath. Justice grew harsher, punishments swifter. Where once I had given trials, now I gave executions. Where once I had demanded tribute, now I demanded hostages. Each act steadied the throne for a time, yet each also bred resentment. I could hear it in the markets, see it in the eyes of Saxon peasants, even feel it in the silence of my own warriors when they thought I could not hear. One night, the fires of rebellion flared near the borders. Villages rose, Saxon banners fluttering where once my raven had flown. I sent riders, but they were cut down. I sent warbands, but they returned, bloodied, their numbers thinned. The kingdom I had claimed as eternal showed itself fragile, ready to crumble like rotted timber. Still, I would not yield. I summoned my warriors and spoke with the fire that remained in me. This land may burn, I told them, but it will burn on my terms. The Saxons think I am fading, that my bones betray me, that my spirit wanes. Let them think it. And then let us show them that Ivar the Boneless does not die with a whimper, but with fire enough to scorch the earth beneath their feet. The men roared, yet their eyes betrayed unease. They followed still, but no longer with blind faith. My name still carried terror, but terror alone could not rebuild what was falling apart. A kingdom stood beneath me, yes, but it was a kingdom in ashes, smouldering, fragile, and soon to be claimed by others if I could not bind it tighter. The frost came early that year, creeping across the land like a pale shroud. Rivers froze before the harvest was gathered, fields lay barren, and smoke from thin hearths curled into the sky like the sighs of the dying. It was in this bitter season that I felt the Norns tightening the weave of my thread. My body, already twisted and frail, now throbbed with pain so constant it seemed carved into my bones or what little bones I had. Each breath was a struggle, each night a torment. Yet still I clung to command. The hall in York grew quiet as the cold deepened. My warriors huddled close to the fire, their laughter subdued, their boasts fewer. They saw me less upon the battlefield, more upon my chariot, wrapped in furs, my voice carrying though my body trembled. Some whispered that my time was ending, that I would not see another spring. I heard them, though they thought me deaf to their doubts. Yet rather than silence them with the sword, I let the whispers spread. Let them believe I was dying. For in their fear of losing me, they would remember how much they still needed me. But England itself seemed to sense my failing strength, Saxons grew bolder, their raids cutting deeper into lands we had claimed. Alfred, that tireless boar, prowled from his marshes once more, rallying men with the promise that my star was falling. In Mercia, old lords crept from their holes, shouting that the cripple's reign was ending. Even in Dublin, sea kings weighed whether my shadow could still reach across the waters. Yet I did not yield. I summoned the army once more, though my voice cracked with the effort. The winter is long, I told them, but the frost cuts our enemies as it cuts us. Stand with me now, and when the thaw comes, we will break them as ice breaks beneath a hammer. They roared their assent, though I saw the doubt in their eyes. Still, they followed, for though I weakened, my name was still stronger than their fear of the Saxons. That winter I ruled as best I could, though my nights grew restless. I dreamed often of Ragnar, of his last laughter in the pit of serpents. I dreamed of Aslaug, her voice whispering that the gods had chosen me for greatness. And I dreamed of the seer, his words echoing again, "The cripple shall break kingdoms." I had broken them, yes, but what comes after breaking? That question haunted me like the chill that gnawed at my body. The snow thickened, and the land lay silent, broken only by the caw of ravens circling over fields where no plough cut. My body withered, my voice strained, yet I forced myself to remain visible, to remind them all that Ivar the Boneless still breathed. It was the last winter I would know, and though my flesh betrayed me, my will did not. If the Norns meant to cut my thread, I swore I would meet them not as a broken cripple, but as the terror of kings, the scourge of England, the son of Ragnar whose name no frost could ever silence. The last days came not with thunder or with the clash of shield walls, but with silence. My body, long my enemy, finally rose in rebellion against me. The pain that had once been a steady fire grew sharper, crueler, gnawing at me as wolves gnaw a carcass. My breath grew shallow, my hands trembled, and even my voice, my last weapon, faltered in the stillness of the hall. Yet I did not cry out, nor show weakness before my men. Ivar the Boneless had been born in pain, and in pain he would die. In York, word spread quickly that I was failing. Some Saxons whispered that their prayers had at last broken me. Others said Odin had come to claim his chosen son. My brothers were far by then gone to new wars, Halfdan chasing his dreams of land, Sigurd weaving his nets in the courts of allies and enemies alike. None stood at my side in those final nights. Only the warriors who still feared me kept their vigil, watching with uneasy eyes as their leader lay fading in his furs. I did not rage against death. Rage was for the living. Instead, I thought of the path I had carved from birth to this end. A cripple at the hearth, mocked by brothers, pitied by Ragnar, whispered against by thralls, and yet I had broken kingdoms. I had torn England open, forced kings to kneel, carved my law into their bones. I had made fear itself into my weapon, sharper than any axe. The seer's prophecy had been fulfilled. The boneless had broken what the strong could not. Some say I died in Dublin, others in York. Some claim I was laid in a great mound, my body ringed by stones, my name etched into the earth. Others say I was buried in secret, hidden by those who feared my enemies would desecrate my bones or lack of them. Perhaps my grave still lies beneath Saxon soil, or perhaps my spirit roams with the ravens. What matters is not where I fell, but that my name endures. In the moments before my breath left me, I looked once more upon the raven banner, hanging limp in the smoky hall. I thought of my father Ragnar, laughing as serpents closed around him. I thought of my mother Aslaug, whispering that the Norns had given me iron for bones. I thought of England, scarred and burning, yet never the same after I had touched it. And I smiled, for I knew this. Though my body was broken, my will had carved itself into saga. When at last the fire within me guttered, the hall grew still. Warriors shifted uneasily, for even in death I was not a man easily spoken of. They feared to utter my name aloud, as if doing so might summon me back. And so Ivar the Boneless passed from the world, but not into silence. My name walked on in the mouths of skalds, in the ink of monks, in the nightmares of kings. A cripple at birth, a terror in life, a legend in death.